and welcome to the Climbing Consulting Podcast with me, your host, Nick Sinnott. I created Climbing Consulting to give people like you who want to accelerate their careers in consulting access to the best mentors in the field through interviews with leading figures in the industry. In each episode, I interview someone who's made it to the top to find out their tips, advice, and strategies so that you can achieve the same success. Today's guest is Dom Moorhouse. Dom is a business advisor, angel investor, and serial entrepreneur. Back in 2004, Dom founded Moorhouse Consulting, which he grew from nothing to a business that he sold for £20 million less than 5 years later. After leaving Moorhouse, Dom founded his advisory business, The 5-Year Entrepreneur, to provide mentorship, guidance and coaching for owners of professional services firms on how they could achieve the same success that he did. As well as this, Dom is an advisor and board member to multiple professional services firms and is currently focusing on his latest venture, Method Grid, which you can check out at methodgrid.com, which is something we discuss further in the podcast. We covered so much in this episode as we explored everything from how Dom founded Moorhouse, and we go really deep into this one, onto where so many firms go wrong when it comes to culture, and even Dom's advice around maintaining your health, and I'd say almost more importantly, your relationships while building your career in consulting. It doesn't matter whether you're currently running your own firm, thinking of going out on your own, or simply want to find out how to have a successful consulting career and a successful life at the same time. There's something in here for everyone. I really enjoyed this conversation and I hope you do too. So without further ado, please enjoy my wide-ranging conversation with Dom Moorhouse. Hi there, Dom. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Nick. Great to be here.
And thank you very much for having me to your lovely home in Bath today.
It's an absolute pleasure. You've brought the sun, so yeah, come more often.
So to kick us off, it'd be great just to give our listeners a bit of background on you for maybe those people who don't know you as well. Can you give us an overview of your career so far and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, so I guess the pithy summary of that would be slightly unusual in so much as I didn't actually go straight to university. I sort of took a good gap year. I didn't really know what I was sort of getting up to at that age, and had a bit of a foray even looking at architecture. It didn't work. Well, I realised that wasn't for me. I went into then an IT role, realised I probably should think about going to university, went off to university, then realised at university I didn't want to spend my 20s talking to a box, so I essentially then took another tangent and joined the Royal Marines. So my 20s was, as an officer in the Royal Marines. Took the decision at the end of my 20s to leave. Had me at sort of 30-year-old, and I went out. Then I essentially went into consulting. I joined Deloitte Consulting, and then 4 years after that, having always had the sort of entrepreneurial itch, I guess, I set off my own venture in 2004, eponymously called Moorhouse Consulting, which was largely a complete dearth of marketing imagination. Again, and I guess we'll unpack this, with sort of fairly deliberate intent, built a business that was sold just shy of 5 years later and was kept on in that business for a number of years, as is typically the case, with an earn-out arrangement. That takes us to 2011. So I guess, since then, my career is much more eclectic, and I have a number of roles, a number of fingers in pies. And again, I guess we can sort of unpack that, but it's a much more mile wide, inch deep type portfolio of matters now. So yeah, that's the broad, quick sweep through my career.
No, thanks a lot for that. And funny, you mentioned around entrepreneurial from an early age. I think I saw a picture on your website of you washing cars with a friend when you were 11. Was that one of your first businesses? Or?
No, good spot. Yeah, that was street. I hadn't thought about that for a while. That was, I think I must have been about 12 of 13, 14 in those photos. And no, that was a company called DL Star Wash. I set up with a good Italian friend of mine at the time called Leonardo. And we had
finest European car washes.
Fun and games, knocking on neighbours' doors, getting them to trust. I have no idea how good we were. There's probably a few cars with scrapes down the sides.
Fantastic. So one thing I think I want to start off on from what you've just said, and it's something that I know to the point you mentioned around being fairly deliberate in how you set up Moorhouse. I think planning both your life and your business, I know from our previous conversations, is something that you've been very deliberate in. I think you planned how you wanted your 20s to look. Like you said, you didn't want to talk to a box. You went into the Marines. You then came out of the Marines. And I understand you
you spent some time deliberately planning how you wanted to shape your life, how you wanted that to look in, say, 10 years' time. How did you do that? What was that process for you?
No, good question. And actually, the question was something I had to address recently and sort of self-reflect on a little. And I was asked very kindly to talk at a TEDx recently, and the audience was essentially sixth formers, and effectively that was the question I had to try and unpack, which was quite a intimidating brief to be given, but it was essentially, how do you future-proof your career, your life, when, particularly when you're, I guess, still coming out of education. And I kind of reflected on it, actually. I can remember when I was at university in my second year, I went off on a fantastic expedition to Zimbabwe. I met some super interesting people, and it was run by a number of staff that were also very interesting folk. And I remember at the time just thinking, I'm not 100% sure what I want to do post-university, but I kind of almost need a guiding, I don't know what, the guiding principle, as it were, or principles. And one that became increasingly clear to me at the time was I almost coined a phrase for it, which was whoever has the most stories wins. You kind of need to understand what ultimately you personally are driven by, and it might, it's clearly everybody's got their own different kind of guiding maxim, but there was a key thing in my head at the time with whoever has the most stories wins. If you had to really strip it all down, great times with families and friends, that's what it's all about. So I kind of remember at the time thinking, well, I'm going to graduate soon with an IT degree, and I could go off into the world of IT. And indeed, actually, when I did graduate, I had some very, very attractive, highly paid propositions put in front of me. But I just thought, there's this other world I've just seen, and this expedition was run by a number of officers from the armed forces, and it wasn't even something I'd even contemplated prior to that point. I thought, well, these folk have got a really interesting life, and maybe that's something I should look at. And I just went back to that kind of mantra of whoever has the most stories wins. So I was faced with, do I go off into the world of IT, or do I go off into in this instance, military career? I thought, no brainer. That's where I need to. I need to hold myself true to that principle. So I guess that was the first point at which I genuinely kind of reflected and gave some sort of structure to what I was doing. I remember, sitting on a rock in Zimbabwe for hours and thinking, what do I do in the next 5-10 years? And then came off that rock with some clarity.
Do you remember any of the questions you asked yourself? I know we're going back a while here. Were there any specific questions in that?
Well, I think it was back to this point, Nick, of, when fundamentally, what do you want to hold yourself honest to? And what is that summary principle almost that kind of helps you, almost like the Occam's razor type idea, strip everything down to kind of making a decision. And that, that just became something for me at that particular time in my life that resonated. When I was talking to this topic to the sixth formers recently, balance, planning around balance in your life, I think, is another key aspect we can unpack. But fundamentally, you've touched on it, planning. And I've said before that a lot of people spend more time planning their summer holiday than they do their own lives, and lives in the broadest sense of work and career is just one aspect of that. And and actually, when fast forward, when I left the forces and sort of set off, I was conscious of the fact that I probably had a personality that could meander, that could potentially, it was almost when you come out of the forces, particularly where it's been a very structured, privileged existence in that a lot of things get done for you. It's almost like being the child in the sweet shop when you come out. There's so many choices. It's dizzying. You have to clearly make some decisions. And I kind of knew that I had the kind of personality that could get a little bit sort of distracted by multiple kind of options and effectively meander. And actually knowing that, what I did to sort of mitigate it was an exercise I would strongly encourage, actually, which is I spent a few days just writing down what I wanted to achieve over the next sort of 5, 10, 15, 20 years across a whole sweep of aspects of my life. And as I say, work and career just being one aspect. And that document actually was what kept me honest to setting up my own business, because, I joined a big firm, you work ridiculously long hours, you get caught up in it, you go off down a path. It's easy to forget sometimes the sort of structure and the goals that you do set. But having that artifact in my drawer, and every 6 months or so I'd pull it out and have a look, that's what kept me honest to even setting up on my own business. It kept me honest to a number of other aspects as well. But sorry, I've gone off a long way from your original
No, I
question.
think you're right on the question. Yeah. And something, especially around that taking time out to write down your goals, something I know personally that I've sometimes found challenging when writing down my goals is actually, how do you know what you want in terms of, I'm trying to think of the best way to word this, given especially the social media generation we live in now, it's very easy to say, I want 5 Ferraris and a mansion. How, maybe that's what you had on your list and that's what drove you to set up Moorhouse, I don't know, but how did you set goals that at the time you felt really got to the heart of what you did actually want for yourself and for your family?
I guess, that's looking at it deliberately broadly. And whilst this is a sort of fairly cliched point, again, it really amazes me how few people actually do. But as I came back to, one of the primary kind of principles would be whoever has the most stories wins. I actually have a sort of an aspect of that plan, which is stories and experiences, and I want to make sure I do at least X amount of trips or whatever they may be to keep that kind of aspect true. I guess career-wise, if I took myself back to that point, I guess my ambition was I want to run my own business. I've got a broad understanding of where it is, but I'm not, I don't have enough granularity on the answer, but I want to be off on an entrepreneurial venture within X years was probably how I framed it at the time. And, I want therefore in the intermediary time to sort of arm myself to be best able to do that and to close down on the question of what form of entrepreneurship I embark on. And so you kind of strip back, don't you, from a sort of a high level goal to sort of the next steps that help you answer some of the gaps still therein. But, importantly also just where do I want to live with my family? What kind of level of fitness do I want? Finances, it's me personally, I'm not particularly materialistic, but clearly there are freedoms that get purchased with a certain level of wealth that I guess I was after just those freedoms. Yeah, and all, into a broader sweep of, what kind of role would I like to play in terms of just community aspects, what personal development do I want to kind of continue with it. I've recently finished an open university degree. I think I probably set the seeds for that 10 years ago. It's looking at it across that whole wide sweep.
Fantastic. That's a really helpful guide to some of the headers that both I am and my listeners can use. And so you created this plan, and obviously part of it was entrepreneurism, starting your own business. What was it that led you into consulting? How did you make that transition from the military into consulting?
It's a reasonably well-worn path in so much as, I guess, a number of folk enter the city or, they go into consulting from that career. I guess at the time there were probably a number of fortuitous kind of conversations I had that maybe pointed me in that direction. I do remember actually, I interviewed, I got a unsolicited contact from Goldman Sachs actually, and literally I remember one of my final sort of weeks in the Royal Marines, and the reason why I remember it is because we never used the telephones. And all of a sudden, this phone I had in my office rang, and I was like, "Who's phoning me?" We never used the phones. And bizarrely, it was somebody from Goldman Sachs saying, "We've heard that you're leaving, and might you be interested in investment banking?" And I knew very little about the world of investment banking at the time, but I knew enough about Goldman Sachs that I should be taking that conversation quite seriously. And I had a number of interviews with them, and it kind of made me curious about that world. They were probably more curious about me and why I was so indifferent to the conversations. But I kind of realized exploring that probably wasn't for me. And conversely, at that point, I'd had a number of chats in the consulting world. I think aspects of it played much more to my strengths. And particularly the area that I joined, the professional area I joined, was involved in complex planning, complex transformation. And I guess it pulled heavily on the sort of type of rigor and structure that you will have as an officer coming out of the forces.
And were there any potential concerns you had when you made that move? Anything that you felt you had to upskill quickly, let's say, when you landed in Deloitte, that maybe was different from the military?
No, for sure. I think anybody that leaves the forces would be not telling the whole truth if they didn't say there's a degree of anxiety that goes with that transition. I'd done 8 years, so it's still relatively short term. But you can imagine when somebody leaves after 16 or 22 years. But even so, as still a relatively young man, there's a sort of sense of, God, I've probably left this too late. I mean, everybody else that's been doing this is 8 years ahead of me. I mean, how on earth am I going to catch up with somebody that's got 8 years head start? What tends to be the case is you kind of shut up and listen I'd certainly encourage people to do that anyway, and just absorb as much as you can in those early months and years. And I think, if I'm honest, I hit a point, and I guess it was probably around 1 year in, where confidence issue was completely resolved. I realized, if I'm honest, that there's a hell of a lot of blaggers that are out there. And once you pick up the lexicon and the language, conversely, actually coming from the military meant that I had a very different backstory, and that actually was very helpful in a lot of client situations and contexts. And I think, I was able to sort of progress some issues where colleagues of mine who'd been in consulting from day one were probably a little bit blind to. I should say, actually, that transition was massively helped by me. I did an Open University MBA at the time. So as I traversed out of the Royal Marines and into Deloitte, I was sort of getting into the back end of that MBA. And that was hugely helpful from at least from the language perspective, and having enough insight into different technical areas that I knew when I was being bluffed by somebody.
And you just touched on it around things that potentially you could bring from the military that your peers who had been consulting for those 8 years didn't have. I think there's a lot in sort of the forces around strategy, tactics, how you lead teams that is equally applicable in business as it is on a battlefield. What were those sort of key skills that you thought, right, these things that I've learnt through my training as an officer that really did help in consulting, be it Deloitte or be it as you sort of went on to found Moorhouse? To a
degree, it's difficult to sort of self-diagnose some of that, but I guess, and actually, I'm probably better off now reflecting on that than if you'd asked me at the time. I would have struggled. But I mean, for sure, the training and experience you get in just deciphering a problem and looking at all the different options and formulating a coherent plan that brings multiple dimensions together, make sure that whole sort of coherency is there. That's kind of bread and butter stuff for the officer training. That really does set you up, I guess, for structured thinking and well packaged communication. The other bit that it does, and it's probably more by osmosis, is a sense of what it is to work in a high performing team. And I've touched on this in some of the blogs I've written, and it sort of really. Well, it didn't strike me at the time. And the point I'm sort of trying to make here is I just assumed everybody knew this, that everybody knows how to build and be a part of a high-performing team, because I'd had the immense privilege of being in one of the most high-performing teams, in my mind, that there is, certainly in the military domain. And just being a member of it, what it sort of imbues in you is sort of learn, I guess just by osmosis, really. So I just naturally took that into my own work and ventures. And it's now, I guess, only with hindsight, looking back, that I can see that just that piece of just how you coalesce a group of people to drive to one common purpose is 80% of the answer often when you're building a firm. So yeah, that, I guess, the structured thinking, absolutely a key part, but the building and being part of a high performing team, I think, is another really critical part of it.
And definitely it's a topic that I really want to come on to later, because like you say, you've written a lot of blogs on it. I think you credit a lot of your success at Moorhouse with being able to do that, as you just highlighted. One thing that I think is interesting in the phase of your life that you spent at Deloitte, firstly, what grade did the program you went in at put you on? I assume did you just go in on the graduate program? Was there a sort of military program? I'm just trying to, for our listeners, help them
that's
get
a good question, actually.
Where you were.
And I'm going to have to rack my memory. I'm from memory, I think I went in as what they would have called a senior consultant, but it would have been where they put in all their mature hires, and effectively, you weren't far ahead of the the sort of graduate hires, but just a notch above. Yeah.
And then you were about 4 years there. So when you left, you got to what grade was that?
I was
manager?
I was a manager, and they were sort of talking to me about becoming a senior manager. Yeah.
So something that, from listening to other interviews you've done, I found quite interesting is you highlighted that you obviously went to Deloitte, you wanted to learn the skill set. You also, you had reached a point, partly due to your life plan prompting you, but equally in yourself knowing that you had got what you wanted out of it. You had the skills you needed to go and set up your own business, whatever that may be. What it led to was obviously Moorhouse. How did that work? Was it that through your time there, you realized you needed skills A, B, and C, and you wanted to acquire them? Or was it more organic than that?
That's a great question, and I'm probably going to sort of unwire a little bit what I've said about my sort of structured planning. I think I sort of generally essentially put in my own mind, which is when I came out of the forces, what you do have at that time is, and maybe this is another point actually from your previous question, is huge amounts of confidence and youthful vim, and I was very close actually to going straight out into a commercial venture and entrepreneur potentially with some other colleagues at the time. And
I just out of interest, what were you thinking about?
Oh, no, good question. I'm going to have to wrap my... It was a sort of more down the line of high-performing teams, actually, and facilitating high-performing teams sort of workshops in organisations. And that was certainly one option. And it should be said, actually, colleagues of mine who did go off on that are doing fantastically well. So I kind of, for me, it was more a confidence point, or commercial point, I should say, which is, I knew I had confidence, probably too much. What I had absolutely zip of was any commercial nous or experience. And I think generally wanted to sort of make sure I understood the kind of lie of the land, commercially. So that would probably be the summary kind of objective I had. And I've got to say the other key thing that it did, albeit I didn't probably preempt this at the time, was of course, you're scanning the kind of commercial landscape for the opportunities and, what you believe that to be, whether the market is ripe for whatever you seek to entrepreneur in. But the other massive piece I think a lot of people underestimate, and this experience certainly did, is to understand the kind of, the supply side of that equation. So if successful, where do you find great, talented people? And just being out in the world and working with other people, just gave me a much better sense of how I would recruit that kind of talent, were I to be successful.
And did you find, obviously, I know you ended up with taking some colleagues you had met at Deloitte and persuading them to come and join you, which I'm keen to explore. Is it the same skill set in, say, a consulting environment that leads to high performance teams as in the Marines, or were there different skills that led to those high performing teams in different environments?
Okay, so two parts of the question. And the first part, I am way beyond any kind of legal implications for solicitation of staff.
We can edit that out if you want.
Yeah, no. I mean, no, please don't edit it out. But I absolutely would emphasise as well. I didn't, and I didn't need to, because it was important to me actually. And I don't want this conversation to be a bland sort of pop at large co. Deloitte actually, fantastic organisation, hugely talented people working there. What it did do, though, was when I did set up, is a number of people, I guess, were tracking me and were keen to sort of just embark on a completely different type of career, would clearly get in touch. But we never needed to and solicit. And to be honest, just as a principal point, I wouldn't have been comfortable ever doing that anyway. I do think there are some sort of standards you work to on that front. So that, just putting that one aside.
Yeah, sorry, that's my poor research. So Dom would never do that.
You can leave it in if you need to. No, so the broader part of the question about sort of teams. Do you know what? There are generalizations that I think are almost more powerful than the sort of refinement of teams. Of course, each team has a slightly different need, but the much more important aspect is what commonalities there are between great military endeavors, great sporting endeavors, great commercial endeavors, and I think they're more interesting. And again, we can unpack this down the line, but holding myself back from going too deep into this initially, Nick, because I think we do it in stages. But fundamentally, initially, all you're looking to get on, as the old cliche goes, onto the bus is the right stuff initially. There is a largely overplayed piece about talent in this regard, in my mind. Of course, you need certain requisite qualities. If it's in the Marines, you need somebody ultimately that's going to be able to carry a Bergen for days on end, and when he gets to the other end is able to shoot straight and hit a target at 300 meters. And every craft is going to have its technical foundations, or you're looking for people at least got the ability to train themselves to that level of proficiency. Consultancy, clearly you're looking for a lot of smarts, the ability to be able to interpersonally, be interpersonable, to be able to present those, to do that in a structured, way. Clearly, there's a number of aspects of, a number of areas of competence But fundamentally, in both instances, you want fantastically collaborative, collegial team players. And I was looking for that, really. I was looking for people that sort of shared those similar values, that you knew would be driven by joining a team and enjoyed that sort of team ethos. So, yeah, I guess it was carrying over again, from the Marines.
And so then I think that brings us quite nicely up to actually your decision to start Moorhouse. And one thing I think, especially as if you're joining a firm, say it's reasonably established, providing people do things right, they seem to self-perpetuate. Something I think people get a lot less sight of is the early days of firms. Unless there are people who are working like your colleagues when you first started would have. Be really interested to understand the steps you actually took to set up Moorhouse, and almost the early year or years, how you went from Dom Moorhouse to a team of, I don't know, let's say 5 or 10.
No, sure. So the initial step would have been opening the drawer out, looking at this life plan, and again, sort of thinking, I've really got to do this, or stop talking about it. And you'd be in a place in your life where you go into dinner party saying, one day I'm going to set up my own company. And I remember, having the thought of, if I don't do this in the next 6 months, then I have got to stop, boring friends with the sort of talk of it. So triggered by the conscience being pricked by reading it again, I took a week off of work from the large company I've discussed, and I literally just locked myself in my small office at the time. It was right up on the roof of my house, and I penned a business plan. And that's a really interesting exercise in itself. And I've talked about this when I run an annual event now for sort of entrepreneurs in a similar place, and I often find myself describing this story, but in the fashion that we've just talked about, in a very structured way, went through the different aspects of it. And I built out a plan of what this business would look like over 5 years. I also set myself very deliberately the goal of getting it to a point of value. So I had an option on that value within 5 years. And we can talk about that a bit more in a moment as to why. But so there was this very structured artifact that kind of came to bear. And you go through some interesting sort of emotional places doing that. And I'll tell you where I went through, because I'm sure your listeners may be in a similar place, which at points where you have crashing doubt, moments of self-confidence doubt. And I found myself describing a firm in whatever it was, 5 years' time, that say had 25, 30 people working into it. I was like, who am I kidding? I don't even have my first client. I wouldn't even know the first in person to bring on. And I'm painting this rich picture of this end point. And you almost feel like you're almost like a little schoolboy that's kind of, just naively painting something out. And, it doesn't have any kind of credibility to it. I cannot tell you, though, how magically potent that artifact was and became. We can sort of, again, we can.
Well, please, yeah. Why was it?
Well, for a number of reasons. Well, first and foremost, because it absolutely crystallized my intent. And, literally, come the Friday of that week, and on the Friday afternoon, I had then, set a bank account up and commissioned an accountant and done all that sort of, boring, sort of legal incorporation aspect. It gave me the confidence over that weekend to step back in on Monday and say, with absolute 100% conviction, thanks for a great few years at Deloitte, but my journey is heading off elsewhere. So first and foremost, it did that, and I guess it cemented in me that I have a baseline now. I can sort of at least march on this. Of course, you meet the real world. There's a huge amount of sort of variables then that you're up against. But I tell you, the other real powerful, or many powerful bits about this, which is, well, first and foremost, when you do get the opportunity to grow, and I very fortunately had a first engagement that enabled me to bring in a small team. And we put a team of 4 of us initially. It grew quite quickly into Transport for London, actually, was a first key client. And at this point, you can imagine the conversation where I'm, speaking to people to say, would you come and join me? Like, who are you? You're a one-man band, and, what am I joining? And actually being able to say, well, read my business plan and see the kind of considered thought I've given to the kind of firm and I want to build, the kind of values it carries, the kind of place I want to be in 3, 4, 5 years' time, and the kind of work we're going to do. It was a massively powerful recruitment asset for nothing else, because I think, genuinely helped, particularly in the early stages, me assuage people that, I wasn't just making it up as I was going along.
So you would give this to prospective hires. You'd say, check out my business plan.
Absolutely. And again, this is a little bit idiosyncratic of me, I think, but a key principle for me was everybody should see that plan in my firm. So when the firm grew and we evolved into annual planning cycles where the whole firm would be involved in updating and refining the plan, it was really important to me that everybody saw that, right down to the nitty gritty of the P&L and the financial KPIs, etc.
And I do want to come on to that, and I think there's going to be, to your point around who has the most stories wins, I think there's going to be a great story around TfL and how you got your 4 people. I wanted just to hold on the planning element for a moment, mainly for my listeners. Again, if they are like you, sitting there as a manager in any consulting firm, they take this week off. What are the key things that they should capture in the plan? What were the sections that really lived on past that sort of first week for you versus the ones that fell away?
Conversely, in some ways, that structure largely survived. What I did, sure. You're going to test my memory. Because what I did at the time actually is I was reading pretty avariciously around business planning, and I think there's loads of books out there. There's one actually I do remember that I thought was really useful, and I'll probably forget the author's name now, but you can check this and put it maybe in the notes. But Richard Stoutley kind of comes to mind. But the book was called something like the Definitive Business Plan. Yeah, so if that's still in print, I remember that was a very well articulated reference point. It's fairly sort of grounded stuff, this, isn't it? So absolutely assess the market. What did I see the market doing in terms of the sort of growth for the area that I was positioning my firm into? How was that market fragmented? What were the factors that were driving that growth? Looking at the competition, there's always a bit of analysis as to just how competitive the landscape is, and genuinely, without sort of whimsical thinking, how do you think you will fare when you land in that supply side? So, that's the kind of environmental analysis, I guess, up front. A whole load of, what is the proposition that I seek to land? How does that decompose into sort of sub-service areas? A whole load of planning around the organizational build. And a great book, actually, I would highly recommend. I don't think it's ever really been surpassed, is David Maister's Managing the Professional Service Firm, particularly around how successful professional service firms develop leverage. And again, a hugely misunderstood or not known concept. You've got to understand the sort of organizational and economic leverage you're building in a firm. And if you get an understanding of that from day one, which I did, I was doing this when I hadn't even started, I worked that leverage concept through into how I saw the organization growing, both in terms of human beings, but in terms of, financial metrics. So there's a whole load of analysis on that front. The other huge advantage you have is you can start to paint the kind of company you want, what sort of values it carries, what's the end vision, what are the key objectives you're seeking to achieve, you hold yourself true to. And then, of course, there's a whole load of financial analysis that you've ultimately got some Excel spreadsheet on the side crunching away. And I guess, the sort of typical final section of such a piece is the risks and how you see yourself mitigating those going forward.
And what sort of, I think that bit's quite interesting, actually, that the risks. Maybe if we fast forward it to now, like you mentioned, you run retreats for entrepreneurs who were like you back then. You have a number of guides on the topic. What are the sort of risks that people need to be really mindful of if they're setting out on this sort of journey?
It's true. Big question in that, it's entrepreneuring. Yeah. Entrepreneuring by definition is, you're taking huge risk. And I guess if I framed it though and put it into context, so I would have been 34, 35 at the time. Probably 2 of my 3 children had come along by then, got a mortgage to pay, mouse to feed. Fundamentally, security of future income stream here is where you are. And, I guess where I was, I didn't have huge savings. I think what I had done in my mind was position those savings to say, well, that gives me a runway, and it gives me a runway of X months. If after those X months, my entrepreneurial venture just hasn't come to anything, what does that mean? Well, it probably means I need to kind of put my hands up in the air, say, this probably wasn't for me, and, I head back into the world of employment. But this is a really key point, Nick, I think. And, what's really lost at that point? And I guess this is where I landed, which is nothing is lost at that point. In fact, as an employer now down the line, I would employ somebody every day who had shown the spark to go off and do that, even if it hadn't actually worked out. I think it talks volumes to the kind of self-drive and proactivity of that individual. So for me, I kind of thought, if it doesn't work out, ultimately, I'll burn through my savings and I'll go back into the world of employment. But, I was pretty confident I'd find another job. I might take a few steps backwards, but, in the grand schema, that for me was my frame on initial risk. Does that answer your question?
Definitely. And I think we'll come back to the business planning in a moment, but you've touched on, I think, two really important points there. And I think we can take them in whatever order you'd like. I think the first one was around you had a young family at the time, and I, just through general conversations with others in the industry, very often hear people say something along the lines of, I would love to do that, or would have loved to do that, but I can't because I've got a young family. And then also that becomes with a perception of life requirements. So, I can't do it because I've got to pay school fees, mortgage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You would have been in that same point. And I think that's the first, let's start there. And then we'll come on to, I think, for me, the age one, which I think, especially nowadays with, Facebook showing 21-year-old entrepreneurs driving Ferraris and Lamborghinis, there's almost this implicit perception that if you're over 25, you're done and go and just do your office job for the rest of your life. I think 35, you said, didn't you? While still very young, nowadays almost people are looking at as if it's ancient. And those to me are two really interesting areas to explore. I don't know which one is more interesting for you.
Well, you're listening to that, Nick. I'm glad I did it when I did it. No, I
over-egged that a bit.
No, sure. I absolutely accept the sort of the premise of that. All I would say is, I think there's no ageism in this conversation at all. And I think, I would encourage people, regardless of age, if you've got the entrepreneurial itch, I've certainly seen people successful, coming at it at all stages in their sort of, career starting point. The key point, I've sort of talked about this before, which is, there probably is, being honest, there probably is a sweet spot in terms of entrepreneuring in the professional services space. Clearly, that there are many other facets of entrepreneurship, but in the professional services space, there's this kind of Venn diagram overlap of having sufficient sort of experience, gravitas, network to initially be reasonably confident in selling and backing yourself. And that's ultimately, again, back to that risk question, what you're doing in the nascent first steps is, are you confident pitching and selling yourself and the expertise you purport to bring to market? And that comes by dint of some years. You need to have been around the block a little bit to pull that off. And I think that would be aspect number one. Aspect number two is you've got enough energy in the tank to work unbelievably hard, and let's not kind of delude your listeners, because it is really hard work. But you've got enough energy in the tank to do that. And again, there is no fixed age bound to this, but I guess for a lot of people that tends to be, they're coming back into their 20s, early 30s, and there's still energy in their tank, so they're kind of in that sort of 20 to 40 years old. But as I say, there are a myriad of exceptions either side of that bracket, but that tends to be the two things that kind of conjoin to give you your sweet spot.
Okay, so that's really useful on the age thing, and I think, like you say, it does vary by industry, definitely. Coming back to then the sort of your life circumstances.
Yeah, no, so where I was, and this is a fascinating area. So where I was, I guess I'd written this plan, and my self sort of computation on it was, I knew it was going to be hard work, and I knew that was going to come with sacrifice. So, there's no doubt about it. And I guess there's lots of areas to unpack on work-life balance and, how you find that and so forth. But my sort of take on it, and I would be at pains to emphasize that this, is individual. And, really isn't one size fits all here. It's hugely personal, personalized. But my take on it was I could accept that huge asymmetry and sacrifice, and I guess, being honest, risk, because you are sometimes, by death of 1,000 tiny little knife cuts, omitting key relationships. I'm prepared to take that risk because I think if with a fair wind, I put it off, I build a firm of value, I've at least got the option to sort of take a different path, and with a fair wind, hopefully brought some financial freedoms down the other end of that. At which point I can wholly restore some of those imbalances, hopefully. And if my wife was listening to this now, she'd be screaming, well, you didn't get it right, did you? But my sense is I did just, and I was probably quite fortunate. I think if I'd have been doing the kind of regime I had done for another certainly 5 years, I probably wouldn't be married. Probably wouldn't deserve to be married. And probably wouldn't deserve to be called a father, if I'm honest. Because it did take. It takes you away in a couple of ways. Actually, it takes you away physically. I was weekly commuting and then essentially working away from home. But also, if I'm honest, certainly my wife would again reinforce this, is that I'd get back of a weekend and your brain is so unbelievably absorbed that you kind of, whilst physically in the room, quite often you're not in the room as well. So on both those fronts, you're paying a price. But that was my kind of way of rationalising it at the time. Hence why I was so deliberate about that 5-year build a point of value.
Do you remember any particular conversations, or maybe more broadly, the advice you give to those who you are talking to, saying, Dom, I'm thinking of doing this? How much should they be bringing their partner in at this early stage? What are those conversations they should be having?
That is a great question. And actually, on one of my blogs, I think I literally did bring my wife in, and she sort of did write a piece on this, actually. And totally, I would say it is so important. And Nick, we've spoken about the broader sort of life balance, I guess, piece, in that I've seen too many people now to sort of count where they have achieved such commercial success. They're driving great, professional service businesses. Everything is like a 10 out of 10, but they are either completely unfit, completely let their personal health go, or their personal relationships, their home life is just atrophied. And what a shallow victory that is. And how many, particularly I've got to say in the big companies, the partnerships in some of these places is littered with that. And just, what a myopic, shallow victory that is. So absolutely bring in important others right from the early part of the conversation if you're thinking of going down this route. And I guess the kind of conversation you should be having, and with your partner, with really close friends, is to say, look, I'm conscious of this risk, I'm flagging it, but actually when I go into this world, I'm probably going to be the last person that's going to see it, because it's that classic death by, as I say, 1,000 acts of omission. I want you as my closest friends to referee it and, make it unequivocally clear when I've overstepped that point. And, just setting up some early rules. I give you one classic example. We used to find ourselves when we were 3, 4, 5 years in, but we'd have conference calls that started on a Sunday afternoon, and we'd have a number of us on, all the way through the Sunday and the Sunday evening. And I guess part of what had happened by creep is that, we felt, well, we're seeking to massively excel when we deliver to our clients. Are we fully prepared for the Monday? Have we done everything that clients are ready for? We want to operate par excellence. So it was part of that sort of high performing dynamic that was driving it. But then after a while, it became almost an internal thing. We've got to be doing this to be demonstrating that we are operating in this high performing way. And I think I at one point sort of stepped back and said, "What? Actually, some of these calls, none of them have had a client imperative. It's all been like an internal call, and it's on a Sunday evening. What are we doing?" Keeping, I think, your eye out for that kind of creep is really important. And a lot of people have said before, being rigid with date nights, getting, fixing times in the diary that are just completely bulletproof and protected, because it's amazing how quick admit to do the little things.
And I think it's really good advice, and especially, like you say, with you living in Bath at the time, commuting. I know personally when I was in-house in consulting, like you say, it's those little acts of omission. It's I can't make that beer tonight because of work, or I've got to do this thing, that over time do wear down relationships. While it's not an all-out blazing row that you say you'll never speak to someone again, you do really need to be very conscious of that. And yes, I've personally found exactly that advice helps a lot. So thank you, and hopefully it helps.
Well, I'll tell you, just actually talking of devices, Nick, I just share something with you which I think helped me. And so I talked earlier very quickly about balance, and I've got a really simple device that kind of permeates all of my sort of online, kind of categorizations of my emails, all my folders, and indeed even the index of any life planning I've ever done has been based on a similar kind of structure. So broadly speaking, and I haven't got this in front of me, so I'm probably going to have to self-correct some of it. But, it looks at all sorts of areas. So fitness would be one, stories and experiences would be another, financial would be another, family and friends, absolutely. Probably that's worth starting with. Number one is that. Your career clearly is a piece of that. Professional development, ongoing personal professional development is another aspect. Community, the role you might play or seek to play in the community is another aspect. And then, you tend to have a kind of another bucket of just, what's going on in your home and your habitat, fixing the roof and stuff. So, there's a mechanical catch-all bucket as well. But broadly, those categories. Okay, so here's the device, though. I would, as frequently as I could, really go away with ROS and actually get that out and say, look, let's score each other almost on a 1 to 10. Or, not score each other, but self-score. Where do we think we are? And doing it with your partner is a really, really valuable exercise. Because I remember one time doing it, and it's probably what actually led me to say, no, it is the right time to sell now. Where, I would go through that sweep, and, on the financial side, it was great. It's 10 out of 10, and career, loving it, 10 out, 9 out of 10. And other aspects probably wouldn't have been at that level. But listening to my wife's rendition of her take on that, and she would be career 2 out of 10. I don't feel in any way that I'm using my skills. And she'd been raising a family and doing it brilliantly, I must add. And it just really sort of struck me. It's true that the asymmetry has now got completely out of place in relation to our relationship. And yeah, I just thought it was a really nice device to do that.
That's a really interesting exercise. How often would you do that? Is that sort of a 6 monthly? Is it a quarterly checkpoint?
Yeah, no, I guess we were sort of doing it probably, well, if I'm honest, I think we probably aspired to do it 6 monthly, and it probably ended up being annually. We'd had to get, at least try and get a long weekend where we'd really, really enjoy each other's company, and that would be something we could do. We were doing it one time, being up in the Alps somewhere and looking over the mountains, doing it over a glass of wine. It was that kind of.
Yeah. That's a really good exercise. I think I'm going to take that away and try it with my wife as well. So thank you very much for that.
Don't need to share your scores, by the way.
So I think coming back to the Moorhouse journey, and I think we'll inadvertently touch on a number of the topics that we've already delved into. I do want to come back to that first project. So, there you were. You've just convinced someone that Dom Moorhouse of Moorhouse Consulting is a credible consulting company, and you've got a team of 4.
No, so actually, I'll give you a bit more about that. So, written the business plan, served my notice, set off, and then it's that oh my God moment of I've got to find the first piece of work. And I genuinely didn't know where it was. I guess what I had done as part of my planning is to sort of go through my sort of network and say, of all the people I know who are potential clients, if I was to sort of put some probabilistic weight into all of those opportunities, where do I land? And I think from memory, it said, well, there's an 80% chance with this bucket of potential leads you've got, one of them will come good. But, of course, that was just a theoretical exercise. So then, I went off in a whole load of conversations and, got the first engagement from Transport for London. And initially, it was just me. It was just Dom Moorhouse setting off to scope out a piece of work. And it was a fantastic project, actually. We essentially had to help Transport for London develop their project and program management methodology and protocols for an organisation that had hitherto never really been involved in project delivery, but had just been awarded a huge, through prudential borrowing and Gordon Brown at the time had just been awarded circa £12 billion worth of capex that they could borrow essentially to repair the infrastructure for London's transport system, and we were essentially helping them develop the methodology and the protocols by which they could build these pieces of infrastructure and spend that money wisely. Fascinating project. So initially I scoped it, and then it became really clear that they just needed a lot of horsepower, this project. And I got permission to I proposed that I needed a small team. My firm's principle, which was a really key one, was that we never wanted to dominate. We were very much a small boutique firm, so it was always much more about a broader consulting client team. TfL colleagues were the majority. We would just be the heartbeat that sat in the middle and really architected it, the program, and really drove it. But I argued, I think very fairly, and also it could have been a much bigger team, frankly. That this team of 4 was going to be key. Got the thumbs up, got the permission, which was great. This is like the first growth, juncture moment, and then had that sort of massive, mild panic. And this is the journey of the professional service entrepreneur, and I don't think it ever really goes away, that you seesaw between looking for work to Struth, where do I get the resource to sort of, fulfill on it? And so, and to a degree of white lie going on the promise to the client, but got the thumbs up, and I had to scrabble around to try and find, a team. And it really was. Actually, I remember the moment there. Well, I think I found two of the three, and almost was at a point of having to go back to the client and sort of saying, I'm sorry, I have overpromised. Maybe you should have gone with a big company. And literally, I think within the 24 hours before, I took a phone call when it was a chap who I had known and met previously, who'd gone off, left his company, had gone off traveling and essentially just disappeared into the ether, and just phoned me up and said, words to the effect of, Dom, I hear you've started up a new company, and I just wondered, perchance, might there be any opportunities for me? And honestly, it was like, manna from heaven at the time. I could have grabbed the guy, through the phone and hugged him. And I tell you what, though, Nick, is incredible. It's the number of times where on that journey, essentially I had said, look, of course we can do this, Mr. and Mrs. Klein, because I think as an entrepreneur, you've always got to sort of overreach and overstep and, never turn down work. And then, have my head in my hands thinking, how am I going to do this? And in the sort of, the 24 hours before, some magical moment coming to be, I think there is some kind of law of the universe that backs those that dare a little.
And how did you position yourself to this particular client? So being an independent consultant myself, I think there's in clients a very different perception around people who are firmly an independent, and that's what they do, versus a consulting firm. How did you position yourself to be a consulting firm that could then bring people in, as opposed to, this is just Dom on his own?
So that's a great question, because that gets to a massive nub of, how you go through from, singleton to actually building a company. From the get-go, actually, I was really careful to position it as a capability, as opposed to, a sort of a single to play. I mean, to a degree, I sort of mildly shot myself in the foot with the eponymous naming, and that did become an issue. There's a side story on that we can maybe get into. But for example, the website in the early stage is a critical asset. It's always going to be one point of reference for a client corroborating their decision, I think, to hire. And I came so close, I remember at the time, to just using a friend down the, who I knew locally, probably conversation down the pub, did a bit of, WordPress on the side. He said, I'll build you your first website. And I thought, oh, great, that'll be fantastic. That'll save me a load of money that I've provisioned in the business case. And stopping myself and thinking, no, if I'm serious about this endpoint, and again, the value of the plan, I've got to project that from day one. And actually, a big chunk of my early savings were in a website that, told that always probably a little bit of a white lie, that you would have struggled to have looked at my website and realized it was just me initially. You didn't
have a meet our team section.
Yeah, I think I probably avoided that page at the time. And I think, you would have quite likely looked at that as a prospective client and thought, whilst it's not explicit, there's a wider capability here. And all the language talked to that, and all the projection of vision and so forth talked to that. So I think just setting off with that posture and that language is quite key. And of course, you only back it up though with demonstrable expertise and capability and asset, and we can talk about that down the line. But projecting it from the get-go is key.
So I think that's a really helpful guide to how people can establish themselves. I do want to talk about how you found the other people. So you said the sort of last one just called you up out of the blue, and after he hung up the phone, I'm sure you sort of fist pumped the air. How did you find the others? Was it just frantic cold calling of friends and associates? How did you do it?
Yeah, I get, it was fundamentally leaning on the professional network, which, I guess was I'd been at, say, the big company. People that I'd worked with had moved on, were already outside. But I tell you, one of the key rules in those early stages that was indirect, which was I knew people. I mean, even in a large, very successful company, like Deloitte, if I'm honest, I probably only would have said that the upper quartile was the kind of level I wanted to sort of have as colleagues. So if I knew somebody who was in my upper quartile, I would be very happy to speak to them and say, look, who have you worked with in your broader life, maybe out on different projects that you would rate. So it was very indirect, but it was indirect through people I absolutely trusted. And I think, we always had a rule as long as it was only one node away from somebody that I would happily work with, because, I know from my own professional network, the level of your competence and your values and so forth. I was very happy to take that. And, and essentially the first few folk came in that kind of, that vein.
I think that's a really good point, that good people know good people, and actually leveraging that network and leveraging the best. I like what you said around one node away and actually being quite strict on that, because I think something that can happen over time as you need people or as firms get larger is that rule becomes more lax. And I guess that's where you see some of the larger firms start to stagnate potentially. So that takes us to 4. And was it then a case that you grew the TfL account and built the firm around that, or did you have a number of clients that came out of that?
No, we did. So you're going to strain my memory cells here a little, Nick. But effectively in that first year, Transport for London was a fantastic client for us, and of course there's a degree of good fortune and serendipity that was inherent in that. But I tell you what, we worked really hard to deliver, just an excellent piece of work there. So I think we kind of deserved, as it were, permission to sort of build on from that point. So the early sort of next opportunities in Transport for London started to creep from that point, and we were picking up other smaller jobs around. And then I guess that around the end of the first year point, we were then able to, it gave us the oxygen, as it were, to sort of look to move into different clients. And I think we probably got client number 2 and 3 towards the back end of that 12 months. But I'll tell you a little side story actually, which might be apposite for some as well, which is at the end of that engagement, and we literally ran it to the day. It was it was like I think it was almost exactly a 12-month piece of work. We delivered the scope to granular sort of specification, and we'd done this in budget, and it was fantastic. It was a genuinely great project to be involved in, and Transport for London rightly got huge plaudit for it, and a lot of their staff took lion's share of credit for the role they played there. But we essentially, and I guess being a project management focused business, we're very mildly pedantic about this. We closed the project down, wrote up the closure report, and essentially walked off site. And the kind of client at the time said, "Look, guys, you have done a brilliant job. I would just like you to hang around for another couple of months, just to give all of my team a bit more confidence that they can absolutely kind of get this embedded and into the organisation." And I said words to the effect of, "You have everything you need." We'd trained the trainer, they'd got all the materials, it was really just a confidence issue. And the only way they were going to get over that hump is to just, they had to just do it. And so we walked off, and we literally, at the time I had a small office, it was essentially my flat in Pimlico in London. And the 4 of us went back to this flat, and the following week we were kind of like starting some early business development, nothing coming in, and that probably went to week 2, went to week 3, and I remember at the time, saying, "Guys, I think we can hold our heads up high, and with professional sort of, we can be clear that it aligns with our values. We've done the right thing, but are we the most naive consultants going? Have we just walked away from selling on the work?" And I tell you what, we held our nerve a bit longer, and the following week, I actually took a phone call from the Commissioner of Transport for London, a guy called Bob Kiley at the time, and I hadn't worked directly to him. I'd been working to, one of his direct reports at the time, and Bob Kiley said, "Look," he said, "I've just heard about you guys and that you walked away after 12 months, having been offered the extension." And he said, he was a senior guy. He was in his probably 60s at the time. He said, "I've been around the block. I've never heard of anything like that before." He said, "I'm so intrigued. You need to come in, and I need to meet you." So I went in to meet Bob Kiley. He was a fantastic gentleman, and effectively that led to another amazing piece of work, which took almost another year, working essentially in Bob Kiley's outer office on a hugely strategic piece of work. So we held our nerve on a principle, and it kind of it led to that sort of growth point.
And I think that's a really interesting story, because so often I think in consulting, by the nature of the beast, there is the drive to get the extension, keep the client ticking over, grow the account. I don't want to say no matter what. I think all consultancies will do the best for their clients, but there is that pressure that you want to keep revenue going. And when you were a four-man business, you were funding everyone. That must have been an extreme pressure. You're looking at 2 months of bench time or 2 months of revenue. But it's great to hear that actually that sticking to your principles really paid off, however tough I imagine it was at the time to walk away.
Yeah, I would say, and there's a couple of points here. So, I mean, this is one of those real sort of cliched pieces of rhetoric, isn't it? You'll see on everybody's kind of website, which is, we aim to sort of build capability in our clients such that we do ourselves out of a role, type piece. And that is so important to actually take beyond the rhetoric and live to. And of course, there's a commercial savvy about this. Of course, you're always open to farming an account and sort of providing additional service, but you can arbitrate sort of the value balancing point of that. And for me, it was, well, with this specific piece of work, you absolutely have what you need, and we'd worked really hard from day one to sort of build that capability transfer in. And so, in this instance, I'm doing your client a disservice by extending. That doesn't mean there are other opportunities in your organization I think we would be well placed to do. I just want to make sure that you see every time that we work to you that we'll live to that value.
Brilliant. I want to touch on the point you mentioned earlier in your plan and the deliberate decision to make it a 5-year plan. I think it'd be really interesting to understand why you did that and how that then influenced the business, and equally how your colleagues and your hires took it. Because as I understand, and do correct me if I'm wrong, you were very open from the start with all of your team. You mentioned you shared the plan, so they presumably must have seen that, right, Dom's here for 5 years and then hoping to move on. How did you manage that, and how did the plan, what impacts did that have on the organization and its growth?
So the reason why, again, I probably was deliberate about 5 years was more in reference to my wider family circumstance. I genuinely felt if I was to, I always knew, there would be some kind of earnout. So 5 years really equals, 6, 7, 8. I knew the sort of asymmetries my life would have for that period of time. And I thought that was just about bearable. And if I'm lucky, it would have been worth it. So that was kind of why I framed it initially by 5 years. But the key point was it was an option. It was the ability to take value from that company at that point, should the circumstances dictate. And, that's the only point I ever make when I talk to other entrepreneurs is, there's no right or wrong about building a company to sell it or building a company and having it for your whole life and taking an income from it. I don't want to be perceived as the evangelist for a 5-year program. I'm just saying that was, worked for me. The key point I would say to everybody, though, is optionality. You have no idea what's going to be going on in your life in 5 years' time. So why would you not build a point and a sustainable, business such that you could, prosecute that if you so needed to? So that was that key point. And then, a really key way I played it was that transparency. And I remember, having advisors at the time who just said, "You're crazy sharing that with new joiners." And it didn't sit right with me. I mean, there's a whole thing we could talk about, just values in a business, and one of those was absolute transparency. And I wanted to absolutely have it out there. And I guess, if I'm honest, Nick, I think it was definitely net positive in so much as, I was then attracting people. Well, firstly, it's always a net positive about being honest. Fundamentally, life gets really difficult when you have half truths going on or you're not disclosing. It invariably comes back and creates a much bigger problem down the line. So that's a fundamental point. But the net other benefit is, I was attracting people that were really engaged by the fact that it was such a deliberate build to value, and they wanted to be involved in a firm that was so systematically going about that. Because on their CVs they can talk about how they understand, how you build these capabilities in a firm, as well as just their technical client-facing sort of role. And I guess, the point I would always make, though, is, it's an option. I genuinely don't know what that's going to look like. I don't know if we are going to pull, when we're going to pull that sort of lever. I have no idea what the other side of it's going to be. I'm just being totally honest with you. It's an option that we want to have in there. And of course, then when you get to that point, you have to sort of manage those conversations very carefully. But I tell you what, I wouldn't want to do it having sprung it on my team as a complete surprise. For us, it was a much more completely open dialogue about how do we traverse this change.
And I think that's a really interesting point in itself, because speaking to friends in some firms, there is a perception that they don't quite know what's going on at the top. It's my last guest talked about sort of similar to how they elect the Pope. Everyone gets in a room and then some black smoke comes out and that's a decision made. So actually having that openness from the start is a really interesting way of doing it. Did that create any challenges, though, that maybe you hadn't foreseen when you first thought, I will share this with everyone?
Do you know, I'd really struggle to think of any. Certainly none that, I can sort of remember powerfully enough to say, that there was any pause for thought on that. And, and in some ways a positive might be, it puts people off. Frankly, if somebody wasn't, wanting to get involved in a company that's so overtly kind of building, internally or wants, maybe, I guess there's a lot of consultants that just want to do their job and, work with a client that got no interest in what's going on back in the ranch. And I guess subliminally, we were putting off people of that ilk because we absolutely wanted people that were hugely interested and passionate about building the very craft that they were sailing in.
On that type of person, there's, like you say, there's some people who I think just like to coast. For people who maybe are listening who are working at, say, a firm where a partnership structure is more traditional, so their path would be climb up the ladder and then make partner, and you can climb that ladder, but it's a different structure. How does a firm where it's being built with a view to sell, with the CEO owning, I assume, the bulk share, how do you deal with people who say, well, my goal is to make partner, how could I do something like that in this firm? Is that an option that's still open under a structure like yours? Was there something you tailored for people like that?
So a couple of aspects to that. And I should say, actually, so if people that don't know the end story is, we sold in 2008. It was sold to BT. Actually, the firm has since MBO'd back out of BT and is back out as a privately owned business again. So, and actually, the construct of the deal with BT was fulsome autonomy. So, in some ways, nothing really changed. So this is what I talk about. It's impossible sometimes to understand what that world looks like, and for many members of the firm, other than change to maybe the leadership team, nothing really, and that's only when those leaders personally elected to sort of move on and there was a succession, nothing really changed. So, that's quite an unusual example, I guess, but, it needn't be the sort of, hugely cataclysmic sort of, end of the world type scenario. In fact, there can be many positives that emanate from some of these transactions. So that was point number one. But point number two, maybe this is not answering it directly, but we would really encourage honest conversations. There's a degree of a bit of theatre, isn't there, in a lot of corporate life and sort of game playing. But, we essentially said, look, you're all really super bright, super smart folk. Let's not dance around handbags. Have honest conversations and really honest conversations. So, we got to the level of a candor where somebody would say, look, to be honest, the reason why I've joined your firm is I want to get 2 to 3 years of experience and I want to set up my own consultancy business, possibly mildly even competitive. Yeah? And we would say, look, absolutely fantastic. So you probably need to join the team that's involved in, the financial planning, understand how firm operates in that respect. Because, what makes sense for you is that you're really well armed when you do want to bounce off in 2 to 3 years' time and set up your own consultancy firm. Essentially the line would be, no one's kind of joining this company for 25 years in the carriage clock. All we're looking for is people that build a better craft and can say they contributed to leaving it in a better place than they found it on that journey. And if that's, 12 months, 5 years, 10 years, doesn't matter. Just honest conversations, and we'll hope to help you go on to your forward journey as well.
And that really does answer it, I think, in the honest conversations. I think it's also quite a refreshing point. People could be honest with you about what they wanted out of the relationship. You were clear about what you wanted and it worked for everyone. I do want to touch on, you mentioned around the values of the firm, particularly how you set them up versus how they went through the organization. I know one of your blogs that I read, you really do emphasize the point of bringing the whole firm in, because I think the challenge you highlighted in that blog, and I've certainly seen in large firms, both in consulting and outside, is at some point somebody said every company must have corporate values, and things were put on walls. But I'd say very rarely do those really resonate with the people on the ground, or actually play out in day-to-day life. How did you make sure that the values that you created did land in Moorhouse, and then how did you make sure they evolved to stay current and not become just shelfware?
I guess, well, going back to the business plan point, one of the real luxuries of setting out as a singleton is, essentially you can pen values that are your personal values projected. And, I gave that a lot of considered thought at the time. But I guess your question, Nick, was about how do they then evolve and survive a team build out. And I can remember a really nice point on this journey early on where, so we would go away for quarterly events, and that discipline came about pretty quickly. And annually, we would go away for a really concerted sort of period of time, typically 4 or 5 days. And the first exercise we did of that nature was to Briançon out in the Alps. We all got the train down, through France. A real ramshackle old place that one of my colleagues found. But I remember one evening there, we pulled this conversation back out again, and I can picture myself there now. It was such a key moment. There was a roaring fire going. I think there was snow on the ground. We'd all been out in the day. Red wine was flowing, and one of my colleagues facilitated this exercise brilliantly, which was words to the effect of Dom's penned these values as the founder, but we're now a team of whatever. At the time we're probably 15, 20. Let's look at them, let's refresh them. Do we all subscribe to them? And we did this exercise at the time, which was really well run, where essentially what we said is, look, if they're just kind of words on the wall, that classic sort of poster above this sort of photocopier, it's just nonsense. It's just a sort of corporate shopping list. But if we have perspectives that we can bring to life with stories again, then, we know they carry some value. And so essentially what we did was, well, firstly, kind of calibrate, do they still stand true? And more importantly, how do we explain them? And what we did at the time was really powerfully say, well, that value there, that was lived to perfection by, Phil, who, do you remember that time when, we talk about, clients being absolutely, critical, Phil, stayed all the way through the night, and, remember he drove over there and then he came back here and he did this, and then he went over there and helped it. And ultimately, gave that client exactly what they were after, but with immense, personal sacrifice. That is living the value. And so for each value, we had sort of these bank of anecdotes that were these amazingly powerful real life references, and so that sort of fixed them. And then I think keeping them alive, because they broadly they're pretty malleable after a certain point. Keeping them alive, we used to at each of these events celebrate where they had been lived. One of our values, though, for example, was effectively humor, and let's take our profession unbelievably seriously, but not ourselves. And that's so often spun the other way in a lot of organizations. So how do we celebrate that? Well, each quarter we had an award called Muppet of the Quarter, and it would just look at utter buffoonery where people had just messed up, and you've got to sort of you've got to keep playing it back into the sort of dialogue of the organisation, haven't you, and celebrate people that are living it.
And so that's a really good outline of how you sort of brought the values to life. And I like the awards. The firm I used to work for had awards as well, and I think that really does help reinforce the values beyond just I like the poster above the photocopier phrase, because that so often is what it is. Bringing us back to high performance teams, you've mentioned
can I just say, before just leaving this topic, as a side point, because I honestly, when I see people do this well, I always see it as being such a key part of how they've then gone on to grow. So only this might be a nice resource for some people if they're interested in that point particularly. But I wrote a blog, which it'll be on my site, and it was on a firm called...
What is your site? I'll put it in the notes, but
yeah,
just for listeners.
Sure. It's dommoorhouse.com, and if you go to the blog roll there, and you just search on values, I wrote a piece, and it was about an organisation called Perpetual Insights. They're based out in the States. I have the privilege to...
I think that was the one I read.
Yeah, and I sit on their board. A great company. But they did that exercise a couple of years ago, and they ran it themselves. And I was privileged to sort of be in attendance as well. They did it brilliantly, and they did it so well. I felt compelled on the flight back to write it up, because I think if you ran it like that, and therefore it's a set of values that the team have been involved in crafting and owning at a critical point in that early stage growth, it becomes such an important totem for how that the DNA of that firm going forward.
And I think there's a really interesting piece to pick up there actually, and also give back to people who are considering starting their own firm, or who maybe were where you were at that point with Moorhouse, is firstly, at what stage should somebody do that values refresh exercise in their company life? Is there a size? Is there a time? Do you like the sort of Venn diagram you had around starting a business? Is there a phase at which you should do it? And building on that, for especially a founder-run business, how do you create an environment where the team can freely say, actually, Dom, that value, don't agree with that at all. We want this one instead. I'm sure the conversation wasn't as harsh as that, but that, I imagine, is where sometimes you may have felt that. How do you foster that environment? So when do you have the conversation, and how do you foster the open environment to have it?
So when do you have the conversation? I would say it's. I'm not sure whether it's a time-based or sort of team size-based, but I would say you'd certainly be wanting to have it, on the premise that, you're no longer at Singleton and self-dialogue. Even if you've got 2 or 3 other colleagues, why would you not have that conversation, once you've got to know each other and you're 12 months into that working relationship? Because the key point you're making as the founder is to say, look, I've set this kind of merry ship off, but it's not going to build unless we build that sort of collaboration. So I think it'd be more about a period of time you've worked together, you've got some trusted colleagues, you respect their opinion, you sensibly have that conversation. So that's the kind of the when, and the broader point you're making is a cultural one about how do you foster a place where people feel that they can talk truth to power effectively. And Nick, that is absolutely salient to high performing teams. And I can't tell you again, the point where that changes and a junior in the firm doesn't feel like they can put their hand up in a whole firm setting and say, Mr. Partner, Mrs. Partner, I think you're talking rubbish, is essentially the beginning of the end in my mind. So, again, maybe this was just something I'd carried again from the forces to a degree. The Royal Marines, operate very robustly like this, which is, we've got to have that dynamic in this firm. And that was a really important, to a degree, sort of tacit, unspoken kind of code. And, again, the great thing about these events were there would be this really healthy, discord and debate on at times. And, I used to love the fact that somebody, the most junior of the firm would have the confidence to stand up and say that, because that was a reinforcement of exactly the kind of values we wanted in the company. As a related point, actually, you've got me going off on this here, but I also talk to boards now often and say, it's a really, really important dynamic of well-performing boards, which Colin Powell, the Secretary of State for the States back a decade or so ago, I love the quote, he talks to, which is I'm not going to do the quote justice because I can't remember it, but it's words to the effect of what I absolutely seek from a team is active disagreement, because I want you to find those flaws in what we're doing. At the point, however, that we make a collective decision, we're shoulder to shoulder when we walk out of this room and execute it. And essentially that would be my advice to a new forming board, to a broader team is, you want that healthy kind of intellectual debate. However, at the point where decisions have been made, debate stops, shoulder to shoulder. That was a historical conversation. We're all of one mind.
Brilliant. No, thank you very much for that. And I think the high performing teams point, which I know is a theme that's come throughout this conversation, is a really interesting one. And I'd be interested about, as you scaled Moorhouse, were there any points that stick in your mind where you really had to adjust, be it the firm structure, be it other elements, to ensure the team remained high performance? Is there a different approach to having a high performance team of, say, 4 people than there is to having a high performance team of 50 people?
I think there's a number of things around professional service firms where you stages of growth where you have to look at this in a slightly different way. So yeah, clearly, I guess you marched towards 10. You'll know each other intimately. It's clear where the team is. As we grew, I guess one of the sort of next sort of organizational constructs that came into being was sort of the idea of a sector focus. So people, team members sort of sat more within a particular kind of sector area. The key bit I think I would say here though is that for me the language around team, and there's a lot of frankly sort of nonsense written by sort of academics on this, where what's the sort of team size. I think you can have a team and the rhetoric of team, and I don't say rhetoric in a pejorative sense in this instance, but the label of team can absolutely be valid all the way, easily. Don't even worry about that until you're kind of getting close to 100, because the team is the whole firm. And professional service companies, in some ways, it's easier to do this because you have the sort of the project, construct, and engagements are going out, in different project teams. And, if you're doing your job well, you're kind of looking to kind of keep that mixed up all the time. So people are moving around in that kind of matrix, they're working on different engagements. They might, in junior grades, they might work into different sectors. Essentially what you're trying to do, I guess, at the top is just to make sure that from an organizational design perspective, there is huge opportunity for people not to ever feel they're caught up in one, silo, inverted commas. And you're just mixing it up all the time. Again, the escapes were a brilliant way of doing that, because regardless if people felt they'd sat in a sub team, they're back out in the true team at that point. But to your specific question, I don't think unless you get, you start to get north of 100 that you really, you really have to grapple with that question if you're doing your job right.
And tell me if it's the same answer. For you as the leader of the firm, what, if any, skills did you find that you had to either focus on developing further or bring into your toolbox as the firm scaled?
I guess I can say specifically something we did embark on was, I put a board in place very early on, and that felt a little bit also like we were, playing a game that was sort of above our actual status at the time. It felt a little bit, that we were sort of jumping ahead of ourselves. But that construct was critical to our forward growth, and that meant bringing in, one or two external others that were essentially much more experienced advisors to me. So I think being very, very open-minded to the fact that you just don't have all the answers. And I was very, very deliberate about hunting down people that had demonstrably done what I was seeking to do and had been there and seen it and done it. And there's a huge amount of value you get from those kind of folks. And then those conversations then lead to some of that gap analysis. So I think it led to a number of us going off and doing the chartered directorship with the IOD. That filled in a few gaps, particularly around maybe some of the corporate strategy areas. Maybe I was lucky I'd done the MBA, but I guess for some of my colleagues that was useful. So I think it's difficult to say specifically, and I think that the general point would be get some great external advisors in as well that can kind of help you with that conversation.
No, that's really useful. And yeah, the board one's definitely an interesting one. I think, again, in say a professional services environment where often it's a partnership type basis or sort of equals around a table. On a similar theme, when you were planning this, so your 5 days, was there anything that through your time at Moorhouse and actually running the firm that was completely different to what you thought it would be when you were younger and when you were about to set it up?
You really are looking into the unknown, Nick, I guess, at that point, sat in that little room writing a business plan, it's all very, very conceptual. Do you know what? If anything, I think, the reality was it was even more fun than I think I had ever envisaged and more rewarding than I'd ever envisaged. And, kind of a key bit for me, I think sometimes gets lost in the entrepreneurial story is, it's, clearly there's a pursuit of some financial freedoms and goals, but, far more importantly, that period of my working life was the most magical inclusion in, a quite unbelievably high-performing group of people. And, I'd occasionally, going back to this 5-year plan, I think I'd penned that, if I was successful, it would be a team of, 30 of us at the end of year five. I think we were probably 80, 90, at that point. And there'll be occasions when I'd sort of look around the room at an event and just think, how on earth did I get here? And, a little brief moment of self-reflection, just think, how unbelievably fortunate am I to have this companionship? There's some just very, very talented, consultants, but just, brilliant people. I used to really enjoy their company. So I'm not sure if it kind of answers your question in terms of the mismatch between reality and expectation, but, in some ways it only but exceeded early conception.
No, brilliant. I think that's great to hear, and I think will be really good for anyone who's in your position at the moment thinking to do the same. I think you've given a very concise and balanced view of the negatives, but equally the positives that have come with it. And I think one of the other elements earlier on you mentioned around relationship, career, you also mentioned health and fitness being quite a big aspect of life. You're probably the first person I've interviewed, and probably going to be the last, where one of the first pictures of you on Google is you, fireman's carrying some other chap in what looks like a race.
It's really scary, isn't it, what ends up in Google? I should probably look at my own name and see what pops up.
It's you with a guy over your shoulder and a number on your arm.
Yeah, no, I think I know what that is. There's a pairs sort of CrossFit based event that actually, bizarrely, I've got a bit of a involvement in now. But that event took place, I think, first time about 4 or 5 years ago, and I had a good friend of mine, a guy called Stitch. I seem to remember having on my shoulders for one part of it. Yeah.
And that, I think, brings us nicely on to the fitness side. Sitting across from you now, you look in great shape. I think you're probably fitter and stronger than I am. You're, if you don't mind me asking, how old?
48, I think. Yeah, 48.
So, there's a lot of 48-year-olds I know who are in a lot worse shape. And I think in consulting, especially, as you mentioned, with the long hours, the sort of Chinese or pizzas while you're finishing a slide deck, how important is keeping fit? Because I think a lot of people, maybe less so than relationships, can go, oh, it's, I'll get fit afterwards, or I'll do that later. What impact did that have actually on being able to perform at the highest level for you in Moorhouse and beyond?
Massive topic you've opened up here, Nick. I'd say right up front, there's a sort of risk that, I come across as, somehow sanctimonious, or, I wouldn't want this to be overplayed in so much as, there have been times in my life where I've let that go. Obviously my starting point, Ron Marines officer, clearly in good shape. I'd say at times building Moorhouse, I was in that camp of, probably getting to the gym once a week at best, and, spending 4 nights out of 5 down the sort of as much as you can eat Chinese buffet because, I've left it till 10 o'clock again. There's no other options. I'll tell you, actually, I had a bit of a sort of a moment where I caught up with an old buddy of mine who's a guy called, I'm going to give him a name check, actually, because he's a really top guy. A guy called Tim Wigham, and we went off. We were in South Africa at the time, and I hadn't seen him for years. But he was another Marines officer, old buddy of mine, and a super fit guy. I mean, probably the fittest guy of our generation at the time. And I caught up with him. So this is probably 10 years ago, and he was still in unbelievable shape. I hadn't seen him for years, and I said, mate, if you don't mind me asking, you're just in unbelievable shape. And he said, you know what? He said, I think I'm fitter now than I was, back in the day. And I was like, well, back when we were 22 being paid to be fit by Her Majesty. And he said, yeah. And, what he did brilliantly was gave me a massive sort of, metaphorical kick up the backside to say, it doesn't matter how old you are, you can always get on top of this again. And I came back from that trip and just thought, do you know what? I've got to, if I'm honest, I'd gone into that sort of slide people go into, which is I am, 35, 40 years old, therefore, this is stuff of yesterday. And I came back and I thought, that is absolute nonsense. I've got to re-grip this. And I tell you what, I started just looking at what I ate, and just, got my nutrition back in the right place. I kind of got back into training again. I love, and I kind of realized how much I loved it as well. But I tell you what I also realized, Nick, is I also realized how much more effective I was at building a company, just looking after myself. And again, back to this point, I can't tell you the number of boards I sit on where, on one level, you look at some of these guys at the top of their career, making so much money, but, the sort of shirt buttons are about to fling out, and their risk of a cardiac attack, has just gone up a huge notch. So what, what is it all about? And it's back to that balanced life point. One of the things I think I did have in that original is, I always want to be able to do, run a 1 minute mile in X time, or always be able to do at least 15 pull-ups, whatever it is. Set yourself some goals that you do hold on to. So, God, you're gonna set me off, Nick. I can talk to this, for an age, but
I guess one thing then
important.
that would be, I think, useful for our listeners. It sounds like you back when you were younger, you were doing this for a living as a core part of what you did for a living in the Marines. You've obviously got yourself back in shape following your chat with your friend Tim. If some of our listeners are working on projects or starting their own business, time is short, but they want to get that bang for their buck. What have you found most effective for you? What's really delivered for you?
Well, do you know what? I mean, again, there's a danger of sort of there's no one size fits all here, and everybody's different. Everyone's got different proclivities and sort of passions, and in some ways it's just moving. You just got to move your body. I tell you what, I've done, and I've just got an old outbuilding in my place here, and I've literally all I've got in it is a weightlifting bar, a pull-up rack, and a rowing machine. And I just need 20 minutes, and I can have myself lying on the floor, in a fetal position. So it's not a time excuse, and that is the one thing that people have got to remove, because you can always find 10, 15, 20 minutes. I think I happen to be sort of fairly passionate about CrossFit. It kind of works for me. I'm a bit of a generalist anyway in that regard. And that's great for that sort of real high intensity piece. But it frankly doesn't matter. Do 15 minutes of air squats and pull ups and press ups, and you've done a hell of a lot more than most folk will. But it's just fitting into your diary and just reminding yourself it's important stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And the point you make around the time, I think, is key. I think through a mix of workout videos and books, people seem to think you have to spend hours in the gym to achieve what you're saying. And I think, to your point, a bar and a rowing machine, most people can fit in a garage if they've got one, or if you live in a city like I do, there's ample gyms that you can go to. So
no, exactly. And there's stacks of blogs now and places where you can find little 10, 15, 20 minute workouts. I think I quite like. I actually have a great guy, Ollie, who is the owner of CrossFit Bath, who sets me a little program each week, and actually that works for me. I kind of, it's just a nice little service that Ollie provides, but he gives me sort of 4 or 5 workouts a week, and I just like the structure that somebody else has thought about that. I almost kind of don't want the mental work of putting a workout down. It's really nice to somebody say, here's your challenges, try and do these 4 or 5 this week, and mixes it around for me. So there's loads of those kind of websites out there. I've got to say as well that I've read a brilliant book recently that has really, really struck me, and I'd really advocate it, which is Why People Sleep. Is it Why People Sleep, or Why We Sleep, maybe? Do a bit of Google bashing.
I'll put it in the show notes.
And honestly, as a reinforcement of the importance of a good night's sleep as well, which is the other challenge, of course, when you're working hard. And it's pretty stark stuff. And I'm not going to try and paraphrase it. Just if there's one book you read about health and fitness this year, read that one.
And I, like you say, that it's not a health and fitness podcast, so we shouldn't labor it too much. But I think sleep, especially, it is a really important thing. I think there, in some quarters, still is the perception, the sort of Gordon Gekko sleeps for the week type thing. And I just know personally, and if my wife's listening to this, she'll laugh. I'm reasonably, I'd say, very strict actually about trying to get my 8 hours. You don't always get it. Sometimes things happen, and not everyone needs 8 hours. I think it's important, but the impact that not enough sleep has on your productivity in all aspects of your life, I think, is phenomenal. I don't know if that's what you'd agree.
And the broader point, being specific about professional service companies, well, firstly, holidays, particularly in the States, and I've got involvement in companies in the US now, is, there still is a bit of that cultural kind of, nonsense, frankly, that, somehow holidays are for the weekend, just on a much, much broader kind of creative, inculcating a sort of creative workforce, it's utter nonsense that you would think, it's sensible to stymie that kind of release. At a kind of looking at it over the period of a year. But in terms of the sleep perspective, this is where I know many people can associate with this. Those nights where, you're sat at your desk and it's sort of 9, 10, 11 p.m. and you're still thinking, this has got to be on the client's desk, 9 o'clock in the morning. But the degree of diminishing return you start hitting when you get to that point is just a falsehood we all easily fall into. Get your 8 hours sleep, wake up early, go to bed early, and just start again. It's so key. I mean, of course, there's the odd exception, but just look at it over the period of a more meaningful horizon.
So I think we've given some great advice to people who are looking to start their own firm, Dom. Something I'm quite conscious of is that many of the people listening, they may be in consulting, they may be very happy in a firm. They might want to follow a path to partner. That might be what they'd like to do. If someone is looking to move firms, so let's say, they were where you were, they were at a Big Four, and they want to move firms, I think there's two things from our conversation that really jump out to me. And it's about how can they make sure they're making the right move. Firstly, how can they make sure that the values of the firm they want to join align with theirs? And secondly, how can they make sure they're joining a high performance team? And I think to set the scene, I would almost say, what if it's someone they've been introduced to by, say, a recruiter? So many of the people I know who move firms, they'll call a recruiter, they'll say, I know this great firm, speak to them. I think if it's a referral, like you said, a 1-degree referral, that's maybe a bit easier. But for those people who are going through a recruiter and they're interviewing, say, with yourself, how could they assess the values and their fit? And then what tests could they do to make sure it is a high performance team?
I think you're just to sort of pick up on that in your segue in then, that is totally valid. Again, I think there's a risk I sort of sometimes come across that there's only one path for a working life, and it's to go off and set up your own business and absolutely and build it in 5 years and sell it. It absolutely isn't. So I think this is a really valid line of dialogue also. So in terms of what would I do if I was stepping into another organisation and sort of seeking to assess the culture, the values? What I would do is I would discount anything that's just put up on corporate literature on a website. Yeah, I mean, frankly, it is that is there's no bearing to be taken off of that whatsoever. Quite often, it can just be some kind of marketing exercise that's gone on, and people not even aware it's happened in worst extremis. So, I think if I was trying to validate that, I would, I guess in a perfect world, you getting close to being offered a job, I would say, I'd like to talk to some of the seniors, and I know that can be challenging at times to get that access, but ideally, you want to get close to the leadership team because, if the leaders don't live those values, it's just a non-starter from that point forward. So, if you could actually sort of speak to some of the seniors in the business that are actually setting the direction of the firm, you'd want to be trying to validate whether that's a genuine kind of alignment to their own personal beliefs and behaviours. And I guess, that's difficult often. So, to try and validate it, I would try and find 2 or 3 people that are at any point in that firm and just say, look, first question, what are the values of the business? In the main, what you find is they probably don't know or they can't remember, which quite often speaks volumes. But if it's a good firm, they'll bring them to life and they'll tell you what they think about that. And I'd be really wary of any organisation that wasn't prepared to give you that kind of access as well. Certainly some of the great organisations I've been involved with subsequently, would make efforts to sort of assign, mentors and give you those kind of points of access when you're getting close to, making a decision. So yeah, validate it with actual people in the business, particularly leaders if you can. Don't look at a website.
And how, I think I'm reflecting on your point from earlier around when the leaders become inapproachable is when the problems begin to start. If someone asks to speak to a leader in the business and they're told actually, no, for whatever reason, no, you can't, how much should someone take that as a red flag? I mean, I know you're not giving a sort of binary response and never would. I'm just trying to help for our listeners. How much should they take that as a red flag versus these are just genuinely busy people?
That's a great question, actually, because I haven't really thought about that. If that happened to me, and if I'm honest, my memory sort of doesn't serve me well enough to know whether or readily put up an example. To be honest, I met, I think probably, it was only towards the latter end when the firm was getting very big that I may not have been involved in the recruitment process. But if somebody had said to me, if my HR colleague had said, X has said they're absolutely up for joining, but the final part of their decision making is that they, absolutely want to meet you as the MD before they go firm. do you know what? I would give such a thumbs up to that. I mean, it would speak volumes for that person. Honestly, it would be such a positive reinforcement from my side of what it says about that individual. I would love to have that conversation. In the rare instance I wasn't anyway. So, I think if you ask that question and you got the kind of, no, he's too busy to do it, or he doesn't think it's appropriate, you've had a very, very interesting red flag on what that kind of organisation is like. So you've made a great point there, Nick. I hadn't thought about that, and I think you can read a lot from that.
Fantastic. I think that's really helpful advice for my listeners. And so the second part of that question, I think we've clarified how you can understand if from a values perspective a firm fits. But if you're leaving a high-performing consultancy, or you are in the upper quartile of a consultancy business, and you want to make sure you move to somewhere where you're going to be working with similar level people, what can people do to assess that?
It's a challenging one, I guess. You would get. I mean, again, you're having the similar kind of conversations, aren't you? So you're talking about values. You also talk. I guess you're also trying to assess where these where your potential future colleagues, where they're working. Of course, sort of validation of case study to the degree you can is going to be an evidence point in that. I think you just want to have as many conversations as you can. I mean, you might even want to, in a certainly circumspect way, try and speak to some of the clients and just say, I'm considering joining this organisation. What do you reckon? I mean, if you want to sort of use your initiative that way, I guess at some point though, there's a, you take the risk, don't you? Cross the threshold and you see if your assessment is right.
And having hired people, you would have been on the sharp edge of this. How much of a risk is it for people to maybe make a bad step? And when I say bad step, I mean they go to a firm and actually after 3 months, 6 months, find it's not for them. Would you have looked negatively at someone like that? Would you have actually looked positively because they've tried? I know you said with, say, entrepreneurism, you would always look positively at that. Would it have been a similar case here? Say, okay, John has gone and tried that, didn't work out, understand it.
I think it would be, really, really would be case by case. I mean, I guess if you looked at somebody's, CV, and clearly we looked at many over the years, and it was a sort of flip flop every 3-6 months, over a period of 5 years, clearly that would ring some alarm bells. I think if you saw one of those, but everything else, looked really strong, you just want to explore it. And if there was good validation of that, and maybe it is, say, hypothetically, value misalignment, and it was well articulated, I don't think you'd give it huge sway beyond that point. So I think it's real case by case. But I think what people do is they overprice the potential tax of that, and not reap the benefit of grabbing an opportunity. That makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And it wasn't a line of questioning I was thinking of going down, actually, but it's something that's come out throughout this interview, for me at least, implicitly to what you say, is you seem to have a very good internal drive for what you want. You wrote down your plan, you drove for it, you achieved it. I think there's sometimes, especially in the city, I live in London, I work in the city, you see all the time that drive to keep up with the Joneses.
It goes off on a bit of a philosophical point, this, Nick, in a way, because, again, a lot of people talk about, success, don't they, inverted commas, and formulate kind of, who would you say is successful? Frankly, I don't know how anybody can answer that question, because I think the only definition of that question is one that is self, delineated. And if you've never listened to A.J. Grayling before, the philosopher humanist, he talks about this beautifully. But fundamentally, success is a conversation of self-statement, and so all you can do, and the only way you can but measure is to have at least some self-definition for yourself, and at least take the time and energy to sort of articulate a self-definition. And I talked about people spend more time planning their summer holidays than they do. I mean, frankly, probably people spend more time planning their next haircut than they do that. But if you've got some self-articulation of that, and in some frame which is hopefully holistic beyond work, then you're the only arbiter of the other part of it. And probably, sorry if I meandered off of your starting point, but that jumped into my head as you were
I think it's fascinating, and I'm going to go and look up AJ Grilling after this podcast. So thank you for that. I think, like you say, to bring us back to the consulting part, we talked obviously about how people can assess for fit for high performance teams, and we've talked about how one can shape high performance teams from a leadership, the top perspective. What if you're in a team? What, say, behaviors or what can you do to help make a team? Is higher performance the right phrase? I'm struggling there for the right phrase, but what can you do in the lower or middle grades to have a meaningful impact on how the team performs?
Again, that's a really good question, looking at it almost the other way around from the place where I start, which is how do leaders sort of help inculcate that? And because hopefully what the leaders have done is recruited well and inherently have people that have got a inclination to behave in this way. So, what you can do to play a part of that as a member is, it's to be clearly hugely, collaborative. I'm sort of at risk here of sort of going for a fairly trite sort of set of attributes, but the kind of people you're looking for are those that are totally up for learning new skills. The whole sort of growth mindset bit is really key. That's another great side reference, by the way. Is it Professor Dweck, isn't it? The sort of growth mindset book is a great book, which is a really powerful sort of reinforcement of the fact that, we never, ever stop learning. And, any social dynamic team you're in, you want to be of that ilk. It never stops learning. If it's seeking to be high performing, it is pointing towards some place of excellence, but it has the humility to recognize it collectively never gets there. So you want people that carry that same mindset individually. So, growth mindset, never stop learning, hugely collaborative, and sense of humour I would throw in there as well. I've never seen a team that has kind of got to a place where it's of world class because it's full of professional, earnest focus. Of course it does have professional focus, but God, life's too short. Have some fun en route. And for me, it's an amazing and very fortunate coincidence of professional excellence with the complete existence, deflation of any egos, and therefore plenty of humour.
No, I think that's really good, and I think humour is a key factor that is so little talked about. I think very often, like you say, you get the other attributes, and we could list, I'm sure, a whole list of attributes that would be great for success, but that simple fact of enjoy what you're doing.
Just don't take yourself too seriously. I mean, if you back to your original question, contribute to a high-performing team, don't take yourself too seriously. Take your profession unbelievably seriously. Recognise you'll never achieve full mastery. Keep working towards it.
Brilliant. And I think to your point around the fact that that's maybe quite a hard question to answer, taking it from a sort of leadership and then flipping it on its head, like I think you successfully did. One thing, really some point advice for when you were running Moorhouse, for the junior colleagues you had, I'd be interested if there was anything that you saw junior colleagues frequently do that held them back. Were there any specific behaviors, approaches, I don't know, even sort of ways they dealt with people or clients that held them back from progressing?
Oh, geez. I mean, that's a difficult one to answer with in terms of commonalities, because I think, I guess it was sort of different aspects for different people in many ways. But
please continue if it's answerable. Would it maybe a better way is actually to focus on the positive and say what for you at Moorhouse separated the best from the rest. So what was it that your sort of generals and lieutenants, you were like, yeah, I'm so glad I hired them. What did they do differently that made you think of them like that?
First and foremost, I think everything builds on the basis of the core of what you're technically being asked by a client to deliver is done to a standard that is just par excellence, is a sort of an exemplar sort of example set. So if that be, I mean, my game was sort of complex program management, and therefore developing a lot of intellectual products that helps define programs and business cases and sort of the organizational architecture of big change programs. Clearly that core product just needs to be done excellently. And I think in the early stages of any career, whatever technical craft you're delivering, you're just trying to get that core profession nailed, aren't you? So, fundamentally, no conversations are had beyond that de minimis. But on the basis, once you've got that nailed, and you genuinely, and actually, I go off on a little bit of a tangent here because I think this is germane to a lot of areas of consulting, is the presentation of information. I see it done so badly. But I think taking a real professional interest in how you render data information in a frankly beautiful way, simple way that enables very, very busy clients to make the right decisions at the right time, with the right information. And that's another side point. But guys like what's his name, Edward Tufte and McCandless, and there's a great book actually. There's something like "Show Me the Numbers" by a guy called Stephen Few, about the way you can present information. I think probably 80% of most professional service firms would benefit from a fixation on that topic, because we're always rendering information for others who are paying us good money to do so. So I think often what goes is technical excellence in what you do. Quite often packaged brilliantly. Those are kind of the key aspects of your of your craft.
Can I just ask on the packaging point particularly? I think sometimes consultants will be criticised for, let's say, over packaging. There'll be a very whizzy slide deck, lots of graphics, nice boxes with limited information. How, maybe the answer is read the book you've just said, but how do you draw that balance between giving the client just the information, but in a sort of harsh looking way, if you like, compared to the best and prettiest slide deck that doesn't tell you anything?
No, sure. And it's a massive topic, Nick. And I would say having a professional sort of curiosity about the absolute expert proponents like those guys I just mentioned is the starting point. And then it's experience here. You kind of, it's about being around the block and doing this a number of times. But Tufte, I think he makes this great point about done well. It's about conveying the most amount of information with the least amount of ink, on the piece of paper. There's that great. Again, we're going off on another tangent here, but Tufte tells a great story. I think it's somewhat. It's been well played now over the years, but he talks about the space shuttle disaster. Have you heard the story?
Go on.
It was Challenger, wasn't it, from memory? And anyway, that really sad moment when I think it was about 7 or 8 astronauts lost their lives, and that was clearly in post disaster. Debrief was kind of analysed to death. What created that moment when they decided to sort of launch the Challenger. And it went to Congress. NASA would have poured over it. This is all basically what Tufte uses as one of his case studies. And what came out in the analysis of before they pressed the go on that launch, the kind of engineering committee that made the call had about 4 ring binders, a foot deep on each of their desks on their committee table, and had to sort of wade through all of that information to essentially make the go no go call. And Tufte says, there was only one bit of paper in that pack that would have potentially given anybody any sort of salient input into that sort of decision. And it was a chart that was trying to get across that there was a correlation between, I think it was an O-ring that went on one of the rockets and temperature. But it had been presented in such a sort of obtuse way, in sort of a clever way, back to, the over-packaging point, that nobody saw it. He then represents this one bit of paper out of the pack of 4 ring binders and just presents it in a really beautifully clean, simple way. I could give that chart to my 12-year-old daughter and say, would you launch the Challenger tomorrow? And she would have made the right call. And I think, to be honest, it's partly about just educating yourself to all of the different ways that people that do this craft really well have done it. And you just, you learn by practice, don't you, and picking it up from others. So sorry, that was a shoot down a wide tangent,
but I think a really useful one as well around, I think particularly in that anecdote, the point around binders. We've all been there where people have colloquially referred to usually other firms' deliverables by the size of them, and I think that is a key point, which actually goes through all of the themes, that instead of maybe staying till midnight, putting loads of supporting evidence in, let's say. If the client just needs the one number about the O-rings, that's what they need.
No, absolutely. I tell you again, danger of going off on another sub point, but is that Where lots of consulting firms are really, really guilty is in not even on the engagement side, but is trying to win work, trying to, prospect for new business, is this sort of turning up in the prospect's office with a massively shiny kind of, 50-page deck, slides. And actually we very quickly learned ourselves out of that. And, we would go from spending those late nights creating these crazily complex, PowerPoints that were essentially showing off to just essentially turning up in offices and listening. So even not talking about the work per se. I think it's a salient point there.
Yeah, definitely. So continuing on that theme of skills, and I think you've obviously sort of one thing you highlighted is around your own personal development.
And sorry, Nick, I'm sort of conscious by diving off on these tangents. There was a sort of probably an unfinished journey there. Should I just finish that quickly before you take this up? So I think we talked about technical craft packaging. Mm-hmm. And
sorry, yes, you're quite right. Yeah.
What holds people back? I think, to be honest, thereafter, a lot of it's around the sort of the confidence, and sort of communication skills. And, there is a lot of confidence, isn't there, in a professional services game, but, a lot of it would be about encouraging junior colleagues that they absolutely had the wherewithal to now, because they were excellent at what they did, to speak to a client on a very, peer-like level, almost. I think a lot of people sort of get a little bit caught up in the differences in ages or life experiences and, hold themselves back. And some firm hierarchies reinforce that almost deliberately. For us, it was a very flat structure. If somebody was in a junior grade, but could easily, step to the next one. It was not a sort of time-served piece. We would say, no, the only thing that's holding you back now is, it's self-talk. Go and you set up the meeting with the client. You pitch your idea. We'll maybe be there on the shoulder for the first conversations, but, it's about developing that side. And I think, you just have to get out of your comfort zone, don't you, at certain points in your career and make some mistakes and trip up and, just start that process.
Brilliant. And I think the interesting point that isn't talked enough about in consulting, or at least wasn't when I was in it, is around the sort of impact that self-talk has. It's something that sports stars have done for a long time. This is a tangent, but I understand you were involved in the Royal Marines delegation who talked to the 2003 England rugby team around how to respond in battle, if you like, how to bring that to the field, and I imagine the self-talk that goes with that. This is a massive tangent. I'm just generally interested in it.
I was peripherally involved. I was privilegedly. So there was a guy called Nathan Martin who ran it on our side. Actually, I was just part of one part of his team. But that was a fascinating exercise. Only in so much as actually what Woodward was really focused in on at that time was a point in sort of military doctrine, which is called mission command, which was less about self-talk. It's more about, I guess, more about planning, really, which is, when you set a plan and then, in the Marines, you get off the boat, you get off the helicopter and everything just goes completely to pot. How do you still operate? And, Woodward wanted to take that metaphor onto the playing field. He gave his guys guidelines, but what he wanted was when everything broke down in front of them, they would still have that sort of self-leadership to drive them through. So, essentially that was what that experience was trying to get across. Yeah.
Okay. And as a rugby fan, there's part of me that was just very interested in the whole thing. But I think, like you say, maybe we talk about that after the podcast. I think maybe this talks more to the self-talk element. I think one thing about your career is you'll have ups and downs. And people tend to celebrate the ups. Again, we'll all see on LinkedIn that someone's got a new job, a new client, a new promotion. We won't see...
Somebody said to you, somebody said to me yesterday, Nick, is talking about LinkedIn. They said, if you look at everybody's profiles on LinkedIn, you'd think there wouldn't be any problems in the world, yeah? Everyone's such fantastic CVs. Why is it still going so wrong?
I agree. And if you look at Facebook, everyone's permanently on holiday drinking margaritas on the beach. But again, I think another topic that maybe we'll have a round two in the future, and we can talk all about these. Interested from a personal perspective for you, during your journey building Moorhouse, were there any specific failures or what was at the time an apparent failure that springs to mind to you? And how did that help you in the future? How did that maybe set you up for a later success with clients or internally with the firm?
I feel I'm going to be guilty of, it's just like the interview question, isn't it? What was the sort of moment it all went wrong and you learned from? I really hope this doesn't come across in a sort of, it's too good to be true kind of way. So there are loads and loads of obviously moments where, things don't go to plan, and there's loads of moments of team dynamic. You kind of think, oh, that's not so great. How did we end up here? I think I struggle to sort of, think of the one sort of, crisp anecdote that frames that. But maybe I think the broader point for me is you just genuinely never get there. The kind of the vibe we had both. I like to think I had it personally, but it was the team vibe is, we're shooting for the stars here. This is the kind of place we want to play, but let's have the humility to recognize we're a million miles away from it, and we're never probably going to get there. Let's just try and keep stepping up the mountain. Sorry, I'm sidestepping a little bit, but I haven't got the.
No, that's. I think that there is a key point in there around humility, and again, it comes back to something that you've reinforced, and we've discussed a number of times around putting success on a pedestal. I think I can't remember the book, but I really should find it. There was a quote I read that said that successful people maximize their one or two key strengths. They don't fix all of their weaknesses. And that for me was a really interesting concept, because I think very often in society you look at a successful person and, as you've said, you just assume they're great in every facet of their life, which maybe that isn't the case. You've talked about how you chose the asymmetry for the career. I think if we focus on the career bit specifically, firstly, I think, would you agree with that statement? So would you agree that successful people focus on maximizing their strengths instead of fixing their weaknesses? And then I guess the question is, if so, and this is the path you followed, how did you have that humility to identify and accept those weaknesses, and what did you do to mitigate them?
Maybe touching a little bit on the previous question as well, which is where things, kind of go wrong, you learn from, essentially. Pains to sort of emphasize that, lots of things did go wrong, but a key aspect for me on that is back to this point about having critical friends, in the room, and the external advisors. So, there were many moments, just give you one where, one of the advisors, a guy called Paul Collins, actually is a very well-known guy in the industry. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of Paul, but he was a great non-exec on our board early days. He sort of pointed out with regards to, for example, our business development. So myself and I think one other at the time, and a senior colleague, a guy called Paul, who was mercuriously gifted at lots of things, including selling. And and Paul Collins said, you guys are good, but to be honest, you probably neither of you know how you're selling work. It's just idiosyncratic kind of circumstance and happenstance. You need to be much more systematic about it, and that's your blind spot now. For this point in the journey, that's your blind spot now, is you do not know how to systematically develop a business development capability across your wider team, because you probably don't even know how you do it. And he was absolutely spot on, and that was another kind of inflection point in the company. And so I guess the point I'm making here is that there are constant, not so much mistakes, but there are constantly gaps in your knowledge. And if you're full of hubris, you miss those. And I think if you kind of go into it with a kind of, I'm never going to quite know enough, and I've got a lot of wise people on my shoulder who are going to point it out to me, they help you spot them. That it's coming back to the question before. And back to playing to your strengths and sort of addressing your weaknesses. There's it Warren Buffett makes that a great sort of little ditty, isn't it? About he spoke to some guy who was trying to choose his next steps, and he said, well, write down the 10 aspects that you think you want to focus on and you're good at. And the person did. He said, what's your number one? He said, go for it. He said, well, what I do with 2 to 10 is I would rip them up, throw them away. The key bit is playing to your strengths, but not getting distracted by the 2 to 10 on the list, which again is a slightly sort of cliched anecdote from Warren Buffett. But you get the point. I think
almost focus what you're great at, not what you're good at. Is the summary?
Well, yes and no, really, because I think there is definitely I think there's a lot to be said for generalists, and I think we sort of slightly overplay the sort of we're only going to be excellent in one particular aspect. I think you clearly want to know the 3, 4, 5 things that you have a good chance of being in the top 5% at if you work really hard, and that doesn't mean 10,000 hours necessarily. I mean, because you can get to the top 5% just by, real sort of dutiful application often, if you've got some natural leaning. So yeah, of course, play to your broad strengths. Don't get totally bog-eyed by that. And then, weaknesses, I think it's just back to the critical friends point, having people that can point it out and, surrounding yourself by people that are frankly more talented than you. I mean, that's the great hiring rubric, yeah? I mean, put people in the room that frankly, make you look daft and, kind of show up your kind of technical skills, because it's only when you become the sort of slightly kind of insecure leader that fears the sort of exposure of that you create these very stifling kind of, very personality dominant cultures. Hire people more talented than you, critical friends.
Fantastic. No, thank you, Dom. So I think we've covered some really interesting areas for people and advice for themselves. Keen to actually touch on what you're doing now. So obviously you mentioned you sold Moorhouse, you've been involved in a number of ventures, and I think you've recently launched for public beta Method Grid. Could you tell my listeners a bit more about what that is, what you're trying to do with it and its goal?
Yeah, no. Well, thank you for the opportunity to do that. So I guess this conversation has come out of the fact, I both sit on boards and, as I've mentioned, run annual events. I've probably spoken, it will be in the hundreds of businesses, since I've, stepped out of Moorhouse. And, I'm often talking about, clearly the journey to a growth point, how you build value in a professional service company, the different aspects of that. And one aspect is pretty key, is that of intellectual property and developing, codified methodology, intellectual property that builds value in your business. And for a number of reasons. One, if you're serious about growing, it's a kind of reference point you need to ensure that your team deliver a service consistently. It's how you might induct somebody into your team so you get them up and running and generating revenues for you as quickly as possible. You can organize wider firm CPD around it. You can win more work. I mean, I talk about this at my events often, which is, when I was pitching for work at Moorhouse, we would often be up against the big guys. And, essentially I would say to clients or prospective clients, I'd say words along the lines of, that we're here claiming specialism, but so will clearly the bigger guys, the multidisciplinary firms. You, Mr. or Mrs. Client, need to validate that. And the way you can validate that is to, ask us to show you our methodologies and our toolboxes, and you can see who's invested more time and energy in that. And clearly they often did. And I knew whenever they did, we had a real fighting chance of winning the work, because, having held from these bigger guys, sometimes it's overplayed. Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a marketing sort of piece sometimes. And, so whilst they could throw out a PowerPoint slide deck or two, if the client pressure tested it, we were able to open up a massive toolbox, which we had, spent a lot of time architecting the interface for. It was just close to sort of £2 million worth of people, time went into that over the years, and it would knock their socks off, and I think it demonstrated we had manifest expertise and we could sort of, position our brand at a premium level when we win work. And then finally, if you ever get to sell a business, it's a huge component of a external purchaser's assessment of your value. So anyway, I'll go off on tangent there. For all those reasons, that's a great way of building value into a business. And of course, you talk to sort of bright, intelligent owners, and they get that point. And what really struck me, this is going back about 2 years ago, is how few people knowing that point actually get to ever meaningfully do anything more than have the one or two, PowerPoint slides or, badly organized Dropbox and SharePoint. And it just occurred to me a couple of years ago, as a bit of an intellectual kind of muse, really, that maybe there was a platform that would facilitate. And I reflected a little bit, going back to that Transport for London story, which, we were really lucky. That was a great first gig. It enabled me to intellectually kind of grapple with how you get methodology across to large audiences and organizations. So, I was intellectually in that space. And when we came back, and actually, I say we were fortunate, we had a great first year of trading. We had some money to invest in things like an internal system. I got a couple of IT guys in, and they spent 3 months sort of building it out. I think that was super graced, and that doesn't happen to everybody. So I just thought maybe there's a platform that can facilitate. Anyway, that is a very long-winded answer, Nick, to your question. That's what gave gestation to Method Grid. It's a platform by which we hope people can very, very quickly, literally within the first 5 minutes of opening an account, get off and start building, very rich procedures and methodologies.
Brilliant, Dom. Thank you very much. And I'll put the link to that in the show notes, along with your personal website, which I know is where you have a lot of the information around your retreats and the blog series and guides that you do as well. So I'm very conscious of your time, and I know you've got to run to a call. So I just wanted to finish with a couple of quick fire questions. And with these, it might be that the answer is things we've covered, but I'm keen to ask it in this way, just to see if it changes the answer at all. So first one, and I'm being a bit cheeky here because it's sort of a 3-in-1. If you had 3 people in front of you, so you had one who was just about to enter consulting, you had one who was, let's say where you were, was a manager level, so sort of 4 to 5 years into consulting, and maybe one who is approaching the point of acquiring some equity in a firm. So be it, someone at, I guess you'd call it director level across the board. If you had to give a one-liner to each, or one very, short piece of advice to each, what would it be?
So new joiner, I would say, if I'm being really honest, maybe you should go and do something else before you get into consulting and have a bit of a backstory. Think about it at least, because, Struve, I'm glad I did something completely different in my 20s. I think it's almost a bit sad to lock down into corporate life too early, but, that's a glib answer. I think
you probably have more stories from your time.
That's a glib answer, but I think, probably not to be taken too seriously. But if you're setting out, frankly, back to that team question, really, just don't take yourself too seriously. Kind of massive growth mindset on, keep a smile on your face, and don't be afraid to sort of chivvy seniors in the firm and sort of make it known that you've got ambition and you want to sort of you want to sort of understand what they're doing at their level. Don't feel don't box yourself down too early. But yeah, frankly, don't take life too seriously either. 4 or 5 years in, I would say maybe you are sort of starting to think about, is this me for a full career in this organisation, or maybe do I have an entrepreneurial itch? I'd just say look out, read, listen to Nick's blogs down the line, and just kind of frame some of those bigger questions, because they're going to start coming up on your career, aren't they? And then if you're at a point of taking equity in a business, I guess you're at a real fork in the road. It's either you're going to do that, or you're going to set off and do it yourself. So be really clear if you're going off on the internal journey, you're aligned to the values of that organisation, and you're going to enjoy it. Frankly, it's back to some of those broader points. Otherwise, come on my retreat.
Thanks a lot for that, Dom. And so very last question, and I think we've covered a veritable library of books across the podcast already, certainly some titles I'm going to go and look up that I've not heard of before. I think the best way to ask this is, what books do you, or did you, when you were running Moorhouse, find yourself recommending most to people? And I'll let you take people how you want, be it people starting a consulting business, be it people wanting to get into health and fitness, it could be people who are looking on how to balance their career and relationships. I think it's, which books do you find yourself recommending most to people? And actually, broader point, we've sort of gone off on a few tangents about sort of exercise and sleep and so forth, but reading it, is an absolutely, I'd really strongly, encourage the habit. I actually, not a random tangent, but when I was, I come from a big family. I'm one of 7 children, and I can kind of remember, when I was probably about 11, 12 years old, my father coming back one time, and he was a builder, and we were all watching telly, children's TV, and he came back, home from work and said, "Good evening, children." We just gave him a cursory nod and went back to watching whatever we were watching on telly, and it was a straw on his back, and he just basically walked over, picked the TV up,
walked it out of the house. We watched him from the window in horror as he gave it away to, a lady who lived down the road. And I never had a TV for the rest of my childhood. Wow. So, I mean, at the time, obviously, I thought it was horrendous, but, it made me read. And I think I'm so grateful for my father for, introducing that in a rather forcible way to me. But, so reading generally, I must be encouraged, not necessarily just professional, because I think, often you glean huge amounts from sort of reading much more broadly. I love philosophy. I mentioned I've sort of recently finished a sort of an open university degree in that. So I'm often finding myself often philosophical dalliance and, Seneca and sort of stoical stuff, etc. But work-wise, I would say some pretty great books. I mentioned Meister earlier. I mean, that is an absolute classic. If you haven't read that and you're thinking of, building a professional service firm or you're involved in one, it's a bit of a timeless classic. Not necessarily then, because it's these books are just the sort of pulling out of my more short-term memory. The productivity, when we haven't really kind of spent much time talking about that, but just getting things done. David Allen, is it from memory? He just talks about the sort of GTD methodology, and again, a lot of it is fairly straightforward. It's not particularly clever, but I think a lot of what it means to be successful, certainly professional services, is hugely just output and having horsepower and being able to put 16 hours of work into a 10-hour day, frankly, would be the summary of consulting life, wouldn't it? And getting things done. I read it twice, actually. It was only on the second reading I thought, no, that works, and I've really put that into my sort of daily routine now. And I guess another one, which is just on the sort of more the health one, is I've mentioned the sleep book, Why We Sleep, I think it was called, but the one that I also read recently was called The Primal Blueprint. Okay. And it's just again, about eating, and there's nothing in it that's particularly complicated. It's just, just really rung true with me, getting your nutrition sorted out, and, how just simple exercises and sort of, movement regimes can sort of really, can work.
Great. Really good recommendations. Like you say, on top of all of the other great recommendations you've given during the podcast. Dom, I've really enjoyed this. Thank you very much for coming onto the show. As you said there's so many topics we didn't touch, but I think we've really hit on some great stuff for my listeners and people who are either thinking about starting their own consultancy or just want to understand how those who do it well can, so they can emulate it themselves. If people want to reach out to you or find out more about you, where can they do it? Is your personal website the best place?
It probably is. So dommoorhouse.com, all one word. And then the Method Grid platform, which is still in free beta. If people want to give it a go, it's just methodgrid, all one word.com as well. And just to say, Nick, huge thanks. It was I really enjoyed the chat, and I believe I'm one of the early ones in your series. So I just wish you every success. I think it deserves to be a knockout hit.
Oh, thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Climb in Consulting podcast. If you did, I would be very grateful if you could leave a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or your podcast platform of choice, whichever one you may be using. And please also share this with anyone that you think could benefit from hearing today's interview. If you want to get in touch or give me any feedback about the podcast, please feel free to drop me an email. It's nick@climbinconsulting.com, and I look forward to hearing from you.